What's up, all my movie-loving maniacs? This is your boy Bangful B of the Lassiter Factor, and I hope everybody is having a safe but fun Halloween. And as you can see, I got the mouse ears and the mouse hat. But I got the Oogie Boogie shirt, which I've ordered off the Tik Tok shop, and it took weeks after it was supposed to be here to get here, but I have it now, so it's kind of mix and match. But anyways, between the 20th anniversary of Blade Trinity, Wesley Snipes returning as Blade in Deadpool and Wolverine last summer, and all the news of the troubled production of Marvel Studios' Blade, I thought I'd revisit a franchise that you don't normally associate with this time of the year, but this year I decided to. I'm doing a franchise deep dive of the Blade Trilogy. And despite what the tag at the beginning of this video may say, no, I'm not gonna talk about, well, I didn't even watch the Blade the series with Sticky Fingers because I've never watched that show, but also I just don't have time to sit and watch an entire series of a show that got canceled after one season. Today I'm just focusing on the Blade trilogy with Wesley Snipes. But anyways, enough of me yapping, let's review. Before movies like X-Men and Spider-Man would usher in the renaissance of superhero films that we got in the 2000s, it was Blade that started it first. And it doesn't just stop there. Most certainly before Black Panther, but after movies like Meteor Man, Blank Man, and even Spawn paved the way for black superheroes, there was Blade, which came out in 1998 and was the first to look cool in black leather trench coats and sunglasses before The Matrix would do it a year later. But Blade is a half-human, half-vampire that has all their strengths and none of their weaknesses. He is a crusader to take out vampires, but eventually finds him going up against Deacon Frost, who wants superiority over the humans. Now, I watched Jeremy John's movie review of Blade from 1998, and in that video he said you gotta talk about these movies two ways, or at least one or two ways. You gotta talk about the movie itself, and you gotta talk about the importance of this movie, and he is not wrong, because there's really two ways you gotta talk about this movie. You gotta talk about the movie itself, and you gotta talk about the movie's cultural importance, because its cultural importance also dues not just for black superheroes, but for what it did for the superhero genre in general, because at the time, superhero movies was just a subgenre that was dying, with movies like Batman and Robin, Steel, and Spawn, which all came out in 97. And you can also make the argument that Men in Black was also the first to do it, because it is technically based on a comic and based on a Marvel comic at that, which you're not wrong, but let's be real, most people consider that mostly in the realm of sci-fi. But if you are of the opinion that Men in Black is the first successful Marvel film, you're a real one. But again, you gotta give more glory to Blade, because it was definitely the first, at least for Marvel. And as far as my personal experience with this film, I just remember watching this movie for the first time in a hotel room. My dad put me onto it, and I actually like it. Seeing a vampire hunter and him being black, little me was just like, this is cool. But honestly, this movie, as well as the two movies that will follow, this is really my first time watching this movie from beginning to end, because I've always seen this movie in parts whenever it came on TV, but I still got the story and enjoyed it when I watched it. But again, this is the first time I watched it from front to back, and I loved it. And it was also the first time watching it with adult eyes, and again, I loved it. Stephen Norton is the director of this film, and he would also go on to direct The League of Extraordinary Gentlemen, but hey, less said about that the better, especially since he hasn't worked since he made that movie. But I just liked the world and vibe that he set up for this movie. And I also gotta give glory to David S. Goyer, who is the writer of all three movies, but more on him once we get to the third movie. But David S. Goyer, he did his homework when he made this movie, but also elevated the material to something that would stand the test of time. But of course, the heart and soul of this movie is Wesley Snipes. His career up until that point led to this. He just knows his character. He knows how to play this character. He understood the assignment. And part of the reason of that is because these movies are at their best when it leans hard into this over-the-top sincerity that is anchored by the performance of Wesley Snipes. He is so committed to this character that it lends a gravitas to even some of the most over-the-top shit that happens in this movie. But this movie is also not without its emotional, meaningful moments. Like Chris Christopherson, rest in peace. He plays Whistler, who is once caretaker for Blade, but is also the trainer and mentor for Blade. And you believe that they just have this relationship that spans years. They have this macho man relationship, fucking spoilers. There's a moment in the movie where Whistler, he is seemingly killed, spoiler alert for the second film as well, but the Whistler, he basically dies, and it's just this nice emotional moment between the two of them. They really do care for each other. It gives the film just the amount of emotional weight it needed. Boucher Wright plays Karen, who is I guess you could say, love interest to Wesley Snipes in this movie, but she's basically the audience character that we follow and get introduced into this world. And quick side note, whatever happened to this actress? Because I haven't seen her in anything in recent memory. No, I don't think she's worked in a long time, but I really did like her in this movie. In fact, she's probably my favorite love interest within this trilogy. She's smart and sassy in all the right ways, and also helps Blade in all the right ways, and actually serves the story. And on a personal note, she was just so damn fine. Stephen Dorff plays Deacon Frost. Like I said, his whole thing is he just wants superiority over the humans, and plus he also has some type of complex where like he was not born a vampire like some of his superiors, but he was bitten by someone, and he also serves as a point of contention within Blade's origin because he was the one that killed Blade's mother, played by Sana Lathan. So by then, it makes it even more personal as to why Blade needs to kill Deacon Frost. The action in this movie kicks ass, even the music in this movie kicks ass. There are more than a couple of superhero moments in this movie where Blade has returned, Blade is back, and he's ready to kick ass and take names, and the music drops, the needle drops, it just elevates it. Though I will say there is one thing in this movie that did not work, and that is the visual effects, but even by then the visual effects just didn't look too good. But however, it is something that I am willing to overlook because the rest of the movie just kicks ass. And of course, I gotta talk about some of my favorite lines in this movie, which are basically everybody's favorite lines from this movie.
Some motherfuckers are always trying to ice skate uphill.
Motherfucker, are you out of your damn mind?
That second one is probably my favorite, not because of what he said, but his delivery of it. Aside from a few moments in this movie that don't feel refined, this is still an enjoyable film, and I will always have a spot in my heart for it, not just because it's a fun, entertaining film, but because of what it did for the comic book genre at the time. I'm gonna give Blade the hard eyes emoji. Next up is Blade 2, which this time is directed by a very young Guillermo del Toro, and little did we all know what his career would turn out to be. But Blade 2, he is on the search for Whistler, which he does find, and then that leads him to team up with a bunch of other vampires that have been assigned to kill Blade, but they have to work with him to find this one vampire that is spreading an epidemic. His name is Nomak, and he's basically a vampire that kills both humans and vampires. And whenever he kills a vampire, they too become infected. So basically now both humans and vampires are being threatened. And so Blade must team up with some mercenaries to take out this threat. Now I'll admit, out of the three of these movies, this is the one I've probably seen the least. I just didn't see it that much growing up for whatever reason. But I will say this is probably slightly the best within this trilogy, because like I said, Guillermo del Toro directed this. He has his own unique vision, and I feel like his unique vision just elevated the franchise slightly a little bit, because he has nice visuals, good practical imagery, despite the fact that some of the visual effects in this movie did not age particularly well, particularly between the fighting scenes between Blade and Nomak. But the stuff with all the new vampires, it just looked great. I'll admit, it does feel like they just brought Chris Christopherson back as Whistler because they didn't know how much of a hit the first film would be, and they did, and plus the relationship between the two of them was one of the best things about it, so they brought him back. But at the same time, it still felt somewhat natural because it does put you on edge to wonder, like, is he going to turn into a vampire or is he not? And that turns out to not be the case. And of course, Wesley Snipes still kicks ass, even more ass in this movie than it did in the first film. Particularly that final act when he is coming out of the blood pool. To me, that is reminiscent of the first scene in the first film, where he is in that club and there's blood coming out of the sprinklers and then Blade comes out of nowhere. Anytime he has moments like this, I'm just like, fuck yeah. Some new people that are in this film, you have Leonor Valerilla, who plays the other love interest of Blade in these movies, and she's also, like him, half human, half vampire, but she's also come to terms with her thirst. And her brother turns out to be Nomak. Norman Reedus, who you may know from The Walking Dead, is in this movie, and he seems to be on your side at first, but then he turns out to be a familiar, but he did have one of the funniest deaths.
Oh, great.
Matt Schultz, hot off of the first Fast and Furious at the time, is in this movie. You got a young Donnie Yen, who I didn't even realize was in this movie. And then there's Ron Perlman, who I guess he impressed Guillermo del Toro enough that he would go on to cast him as Hellboy. But Ron Perlman is also a bright spot within this film. I'll say hardly anything doesn't work in this film. If anything, I do feel like there is a section within the middle that does drag the movie on a little bit. I did like the first and the third act more than I did the middle act. But everything else surrounding this movie just worked. I am also going to give Blade 2 the heart eyes emoji. And finally, we have Blade Trinity, which came out 20 years ago as of this coming December, so happy anniversary. But this is clearly the weakest of the series, and I'll explain how. But Blade Trinity takes place sometime after the events of the second film. Blade, he is still hunting for vampires, but then soon finds himself being framed for killing a human that he thought was a vampire, but turned out to be a familiar. And then Whistler gets killed. And so now Ryan Reynolds is forced to team up with two individuals known as Hannibal King and Whistler's long-lost daughter, Abigail Whistler, because a group of vampires has resurrected Dracula, and they did that so that they can take out Blade and also, again, reign supreme over vampires. Gee, that's not derivative.
I must have heard hundreds of you rodents make the same claim. Each one of them have tasted the end of my sword.
Hey yo, pause, Wesley. Now, I'll admit, I honestly didn't know the hate that this movie got until later in life, because I did used to watch this on TV all the time. I do like two songs off of the soundtrack. One called Fatal by RZA, and the other one called Thirsty by the late Old Dirty Bastard, rest in peace, and Black Keith. But aside from that, anytime I did catch this movie, I did recognize that, yeah, this movie does have some problems. But I somehow still have a soft spot in my heart for it, for some things that I thought the movie did good. Now, David S. Goyer, who I did mention, wrote the first two films, and not only did he write this movie, or at least co-wrote this movie, but he is also hired to direct it. And if you know all the behind-the-scenes drama surrounding this film, you know it basically plagued this movie. I've heard stories about Wesley Snipes being difficult to work with this movie, even right down to responding with post-it notes and just wouldn't break character as Blade, which is not unheard of for an actor to do, but it just went too extreme in this movie, apparently. But for some things that I did like about this movie is the relationship between Blade and Whistler is still present here, even more so because Whistler mentions in the movie that he's made enemies on both sides now, and so he just doesn't want Blade to be alone. Blade is put in a position where he is in custody of the FBI, and this could have been a fun premise where he has to work with the FBI to take out a common threat. But all that goes out the door once he is saved by Hannibal King and Abigail Whistler. Now, this was a fun action scene, I'll admit, and I did even like the joke where he had to go back for his sword, and he jumps out the building and says,
Forgot my sword.
Now, these two are played by Jessica Biel and Ryan Reynolds. Jessica Biel, she's fine at best in this movie. But Ryan Reynolds, who everybody remembers in this movie, this was basically the prototype for Deadpool, and he has a narration in this movie, and I could not help but hear Deadpool. But he used to be a vampire until he was cured, but still has some vampire urges. But this was the section in the movie that I felt dragged and was just not good at all. Now, both this movie and Blade 2 are definite products of 2000s action movies, but at least in Blade 2 I felt like it was a little balanced, but here it's a shameless product of the 2000s, because there's even a montage in this movie that kind of took me out of it. And talk about production's troubles, it's definitely clear that Ryan Reynolds and Wesley Snipes didn't get along doing this movie, or at least Wesley Snipes didn't like Ryan Reynolds.
I don't like you. You never did.
Dracula, or Drake as he's referred to in this movie, is the villain, and like I said, he just has the same premise as all the other villains in this movie. There's Danica, played by Parker Posey, barely rememberable. There's some cheesy moments in this movie that just didn't work. Like I said, I felt the first and the third act was the strongest, but the second act just was not the strongest. But even the third act, it was a little over the top at times, though I was entertained. I did like the final sword fight between Blade and Drac. And there's two endings to this movie. There's the ending where Drake gives a parting gift and he basically changes into Blade. So the FBI got him and he changes back into Drake. And then Blade, he goes on running the streets. And then there's the other ending where the FBI did get Blade and then he wakes up and then goes running the streets again. There was a possible tease of a spin-off with Hannibal King and Abigail Whistler, but that never happened. Lucky enough, Ryan Reynolds would get his own little thing, but we all know how that turned out. Blade Trinity is without a doubt the weakest of the trilogy, but for me it's just a mixed bag. But it was definitely the death of this franchise. I'm gonna give Blade Trinity the shoulder shrug emoji. And that's my 2 cents on the Blade movies. And aside from Blade Trinity, I do think we have a solid trilogy here with at least 2 good films that is anchored by the performance of Wesley Snipes. Like I said, everything in his career led up to this role right here. This is definitely his franchise and will definitely be remembered for it for years to come. And it's even more clear to me now, more than ever, as to why it's probably hard for Disney and Marvel Studios to get their shit together with this new Blade, because you are just not gonna top this. I mean, you probably can, but it's gonna take a lot of work and resources to do so. And I'm holding out faith for Mahershala Ali, but given how long it's taking this movie to even get off the ground, I suspect he ain't gonna attach himself to this project any more longer. I'm sure he wants to move on and do other projects. The Blade movies are in a league of their own, and trying to incorporate that into what the Marvel Cinematic Universe has established is gonna be very difficult. Again, I think that they could do it, but it's all on their execution. But until then, and as far as I'm concerned, in my heart,
There's only been one Blade. There's only ever going to be one Blade.
thank y'all so much for watching. I hope y'all enjoyed this little franchise deep dive. Have you seen any of these movies? Well, I'm sure you have, but if so, let me know what you think of them in the comments section below. And let me know what you think of all the troubled production surrounding Marvel Studios' Blade. This is your boy Bankful B of the Lassiter Factor. Stay safe, wash your hands, and again, happy Halloween. And until next time,
Blade. Ready to die.
I was born ready, motherfucker.